It's the war they don't tell you about. It's a war that they wish never happened. And half a century later, it is even easier simply not to talk about it, to walk carefully around it, shroud it, lock it away like it was some receding bad dream. And yet, it remains embedded like a terrible, festering scar on a young nation. Independent India was a tender 15 years old when it was humiliatingly crushed by a far more focused, far more relentless adversary, China. For a world that had watched Delhi and Peking, two big promising new nations, grow closer and consolidate a blossoming friendship in the 1950s, the war was a terrifying subversion. As newly established republics in the 1940s, India and China had a healthy and mutual impulse towards each other. Even India's classified official history of the 1962 war says this was for historical, political, geographical, cultural, and sentimental reasons. The diplomatic affection between the two countries became an undeniable template for a world that was recovering after two destructive wars and decades of colonialism.
In 1951, India refused to attend a conference in San Francisco where a peace treaty was to be signed with Japan simply because China was not invited. China and its premier Zhou Enlai were considered untouchables in the New World Order, and yet Nehru went out on a limb to project Peking as an inextricable part of this new comity. India, by its very actions by this time, had begun to make it amply clear that stability in Asia would be threatened if China was left out in the cold.
At the pinnacle of their famous mutual warmth, in 1954, India and China signed the legendary Panchsheel, an agreement based on 5 principles that would guide and forever solidify their peaceful coexistence. A pact that intended to build on decades of unbridled congeniality between the two Asian giants. But at every step, as it turned out, India's Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was being carefully and meticulously deceived. Because as China openly reflected its friendship with India, it had all along been putting together covert plans to help itself to sovereign Indian territory. In 1956, China built a road cutting across Ladakh's Aksai Chin area, connecting Xinjiang and Tibet, making the Aksai Chin far more accessible to the People's Liberation Army than its Indian counterpart. In the eastern sector, in the then Northeast Frontier Agency or NEFA, Indian troops began patrolling heights that China saw as a violation of the disputed McMahon Line. In 1961 and early 1962, a series of skirmishes saw the two armies come ever closer to a confrontation. Then, on October the 20th, 1962, exactly 50 years ago, the first Chinese shells came screaming down, and the war had begun.
After 1947, Nehru had never imagined that he would be a wartime prime minister, certainly not in a war against China. But when those first shells fell on October the 20th, 1962, it made one thing very, very clear. If war, as the saying goes, is a continuation of politics by other means, then Nehru knew very well by now that there would be no more talking.
In 1962, The northeast frontier, in its vulnerable entirety, fell under the command of Lieutenant General Brij Mohan Kaul. General Kaul, an Army Service Corps officer, had been handpicked by Nehru and his Defence Minister V.N. Krishna Menon. He was to lead a fighting corps raised specifically to keep a check on the Chinese. On his first day in the new post, General Kaul visited the Namkachu Valley, situated in the tri-junction of Tibet, Bhutan and India. This was the very sector that would be terrifyingly overrun by the Chinese just weeks later. On October the 20th, 3 regiments of Chinese troops mounted a blistering attack along the southern bank of the Namkachu River. Prepared for a formidable Indian response, what the Chinese went up against was a pitiful group less than a battalion strong.
Adequate preparations were not done. We didn't have adequate roads, tracks. We didn't have enough number of logistical support. And notwithstanding all that, somehow the political leadership and the military leadership on top also did not gel.
The game appeared to be up even before the first shells fell. At 5:14 that morning, Chinese mortars began bombarding Indian positions, while an infantry battalion crept up behind Indian lines to cut off Indian positions entirely. A series of tactical maneuvers across the McMahon line flung the Indian soldiers from their positions. With an overwhelming position of power, the Chinese marched on into the rest of Nefa. On the 22nd of October, the Chinese attacked Walong on the McMahon line. After some resistance by Indian counterfire, sheer numbers overwhelmed the Indians.
Even 30 or 40 kilometers in the hills, it's maybe a 6-7 day march at 16,000, 18,000 feet. People go mountaineering there. I mean, our troops were underclad. I don't think they had winter warfare clothing. They didn't have snow goggles. All the things which you need to fight a war up in the mountains in extreme cold.
The following day, the Indian army managed to exact an expensive toll on the advancing Chinese army, catching them in a gorge and managing to kill as many as 200 troops. But any gains were swatted aside by the terrifying numbers of Chinese who came wave after unstoppable wave. Crossing through the Bumla Pass, Chinese troops mounted a 3-pronged attack on Tawang. Woefully under-equipped, undermanned, Indian army formations offered no resistance. Through Tawang, the Chinese were now in a commanding positions over territory that they had always felt was rightfully theirs. Stray confrontations followed between both armies at Wolong. While India failed to rush in reinforcements to stem the tide of invaders, the Chinese army had established a perfect chain of supply. The People's Liberation Army brought in backup formations at regular intervals, turning the war in the eastern sector into a ludicrously one-sided affair. As with every war, there are legends of astonishing bravery, and so it was with this lost war of India. There are tales of Indian soldiers who continued to fight even when they knew it would only end in their death. The 7th Brigade, once a proud formation full of legendary fighting units, had been crushed completely. Not because it couldn't fight back, but because the monumental lack of forward planning and the brute force of China's attack left them entirely without possibilities for credible defense. The 7th Brigade commander, Brigadier John Parashuram Dalvi, was captured by the Chinese. He was only repatriated to India the following year. 2 days after Brigadier Dalvi was captured by the Chinese forces, the first phase of the war wound to an abrupt halt.
Around December, 2 army officers came. they were with my headmaster. They came with the very bad news that he had been killed in action. This was a big jolt to the family towards the end of March, when one of my masters heard on the BBC that he was alive, that he was a prisoner, that he had been kept in a place outside of Lhasa. So it was proven that he was alive.
In 3 days, the Northeast Frontier Agency was gone. The Chinese were in complete control. The position was a terrible shock to India's political leadership, which by this time was confounded towards total defeat. But the East was only one side of this terrifying campaign.
On October the 24th, the war abruptly ceased, and there was little or no fighting for 3 full weeks. After 4 days of crushing battle, the Chinese were now in a commanding position and holding Indian territory with overwhelming force. Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai commanded his troops to hold ground and advance no further. With Indian troops retreating to safer zones, Zhou Enlai used the lull to negotiate with Nehru. He wrote to the Indian Prime Minister proposing 4 things: a negotiated settlement of the boundary, that both sides disengage and withdraw 20 kilometers from the present lines of actual control, a Chinese withdrawal north in the Nefa, and that China and India not cross lines of present control in Ladakh's Aksai Chin area. Politically wounded and angry by the betrayal, Nehru refused to bow. The Indian Parliament declared a national emergency and rapidly passed a resolution to quote-unquote drive out the aggressors from the sacred soil of India. On November the 14th, Nehru told Zhou Enlai there would be no deal. Just hours later, the war resumed both in Nefa and in Ladakh.
Military leadership also at the top level certainly failed. Political leadership also failed. And notwithstanding the lower ranks, whatever happened, the situation should have been not as shameful as it happened later.
Unlike the East, tactically the situation in Ladakh's Aksai Chin was infinitely worse. Although disputed, it was already almost entirely under Chinese control. At the same time that their brothers in arms more than 1,000 kilometers away began bombarding the Namkachu Valley in the east, Chinese forces opened up their battle in the northern sector with assaults on the Chipchap Valley, Galwan, and the famous Pangong Lake. The Indian army suffered huge casualties as the Chinese mounted a string of attacks through the western sector. After the October 20th attack, the position fell silent forever. After the 3-week lull, when the war resumed, the stuff of legend would come to pass. No battle in this most appallingly inhospitable of war zones has ever quite matched the Indian defense of the strategic Rezang Ridge.
Army was not prepared, they were not geared up. World War I weaponry, rifles were outdated, fighting against AK-47s. But the army, the Indian army is the Indian army, probably the best army in the world. They fought against all odds. They fought very well.
Situated along the southeastern approach to Ladakh's Chushul Valley, Rezangla was where perhaps the greatest last stand of the war was fought. The 13th Kumaon Regiment's Charlie Company had been tasked with defending the approach to a valley that had a strategic airstrip. At 16,000 feet, in horrifically inhospitable cold and snow, the Indian unit fought back an epic assault by Chinese forces. As the wind howled through those heights, Major Shaitan Singh, leader of the Charlie Company, and his men fought back and stood firm. The soldiers were doomed from the start. Without artillery support and facing barrage after barrage of heavy Chinese guns, Major Shaitan's unit stood steadfast, doing everything it possibly could to hold ground. In those freezing temperatures, the young officer fought the battle of his life. Seriously wounded and bleeding, he continued to fight and to raise the morale of his battered unit. When his last breath finally left him, Major Shaitan remained in battle position, his hand on the trigger of his weapon.
There were 26 Assam rifle platoons, I think, in Nifa at the time when the war broke out. There were 2 infantry brigades, which was 5 brigade and 7 brigade, which were holding your entire Arunachal Pradesh, which is today being held by 2 corps. And what was finally arraigned against them were 3 Chinese divisions in just Tawang. Forget about the other sectors. So they were completely outnumbered in the end.
Rezangla was overrun, but not without a massive expense to the far more powerful Chinese. While China has never published official figures, an estimate suggests that as many as 500 Chinese troops were felled by the brave 13 Kumaon Regiment's Charlie Company that day. 114 of 123 Indian soldiers who held those positions perished in the onslaught. Major Shaitan Singh would later be awarded a posthumous Paramveer Chakra, the country's highest wartime gallantry decoration, and his name would pass into legend as one of the country's bravest soldiers of all time. The defeat didn't just plunge India into an all-engulfing gloom. It effectively broke Nehru, who until that time had enjoyed the status of a towering statesman. His health steadily deteriorated after the war, and it is often said that when he breathed his last, less than 2 years later, it was of a broken heart over a betrayal he could never reconcile himself with. While the decisions of many, including Defence Minister Krishna Menon, became the source of harsh derision, it was Nehru who was isolated in the blame. To many, it was Nehru, after all, who naively promoted a pacifist attitude towards a scheming China, failing at every step to anticipate the country's sinister plans. It was Nehru who was seen to have ignored the thundering warnings and concrete action plans of Eastern Commander Lieutenant General S.P.P. Thorat a full 2 years before the 1962 war. When the fighting began, it was Nehru who decided not to call in the Air Force to bomb Chinese positions, an action that a section of military historians believes may have just lost the war for India. This was Nehru's war to lose.
It was an incredibly short war, just over a month. But the shame it drove into India's DNA wouldn't be assuaged for years. 50 years on, it still really hasn't. Just 3 years after the 1962 disaster, India would be at war again, this time with Pakistan. And 6 years after that, there would finally be military redemption in the liberation of Bangladesh. But nothing, no military operation has ever quite alleviated the terrible effects of what happened in 1962.
Hey, mere watan ke log, zara aankh mein bhar lo paani, ye shaheed hue hain unki, zara yaad karo qurbani.
7 months after the war, Nehru was famously brought to tears as Lata Mangeshkar sang this iconic song of patriotism. The defeat would forever influence Indian battle planning. It united the country like only a war could. Most importantly, it was a terrifying awakening for a country that had been in a dream world about its neighborhood. A realization that Pakistan was not the only nor the most dangerous of its border adversaries. The dragon and the elephant were real.
50 years ago, India was crushed. There's no escaping from that fact. The 1962 war will and should weigh on a country's conscience, but it would be wrong to say that no lessons have been learned. In the much smaller likelihood that India and China go to war again, the cost to both countries would be infinitely higher. The world has changed. In such a situation, perhaps, as someone famously said, the real enemy is war itself. 1962, the war that India lost. Let us never forget.
देश में थी दिवाली, वो खेल रहे थे होली। जब हम बैठे थे घरों में, जब हम